Welcome to the Mad Pastors Podcast, the honest podcast for honest pastors, powered by G6 Allies, because everybody needs an ally.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Mad Pastors. Tough day again, so that means it's Mad Pastor Day.
Hump day, and I'm a mad pastor.
Hump day.
And we're blue.
That's true. This is the day the analytics said is the best to drop a podcast, but sometimes I think for pastors, this is a hard day. So we appreciate you listening to us and connecting, because this is midweek. Unless you don't do midweek, and then it's an easy day. So let's just roll with it. But we've been doing our series called
Red flags.
Red flags. So I don't know if I'm ever going to get used to that. So when we're done with the series,
No.
But we've got
Not every series will be a red flag, Ian.
No, that's true. I hope there are always red flags for people, but not for me. Either way, we've talked with so many different people, and I know you've seen this with James Hawkins, and so now we're spending a lot of time diving in with specific staff positions. We talked about this. We're talking about this, and we've bashed a lot of these, so we recorded them early and we're letting them go. But at one point, we talked about the idea that ministry specializations may not seem super scriptural when you go back. And that's kind of a phenomena of, I want to say the late 20th century, where churches would grow, people would connect. But we also know that it's just a huge deal to have specific pastors working with specific demographics of people. And so we want to be able to do one with a head pastor, because at the end of the day, the head pastor, positive or negative, will set the tone for your church. Usually the health of the environment, and they, I hate to say this, obviously God has the power to do this, but they are the people that are entrusted with the most power to make the most change.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that those specialization roles,
Sure.
that they're not scriptural, we don't mean
Right.
that, that it's anti-biblical to have a student pastor and kids pastor. Right?
I would be anti-biblical.
I mean, there's a lot of Karens out there. I want to prevent the emails that we're going to get in the comments on the YouTube page.
Of a Karen, a Keith, or something like that. They made up a name for it.
Yeah,
I think it's Karen and Keith.
Yeah,
that's true. But I've been a student pastor for 15
Carol,
years.
I'm Keith.
Oh, that's awesome. But yes.
But yeah, so not that it's not scriptural, but that you don't see that precedent in Scripture of those different roles. You don't see a student pastor mentioned in the New Testament. You don't see a kids pastor mentioned in the New Testament. You just see pastors or elders, overseers, whatever word you want.
It's just important to know that we want to break those down, and those are things that exist and things that are important things.
And as in our modern context, that is the reality that we have these different areas of specialization. And so we wanted to hear from different voices. So we heard from Stephen Bell as a student pastor, right? And we heard from Brandon as a worship pastor. We heard from John as a kids pastor. So we're getting all of these different perspectives on their specific role. But you're right, as a lead pastor or an executive pastor in the business world, we would call it a C-suite role, a C-suite office, where you're in the leadership role of the church. You carry the broad weight of the entire church. And so there's a lot of different aspects to that we want to talk through.
True.
And so as we're thinking who we might interview and who we might bring for this particular one, I wanted somebody. We could have split it out and done one with a lead pastor, one with an executive pastor, or one with the church planner.
Sure.
And I thought, you know what? No, let's just combine all of that into one person.
Synergy.
Called a super pastor.
1999. Synergy.
Donnie Grigg is with us.
Hey, Donnie.
Donnie, so glad to have you, my friend.
How you doing, brother?
Hey guys, how are you?
Good.
Great. You're doing great.
I still contend, though, that the reason student pastors came about was because at one point they decided it was just not dignified to shave your legs for a number of camp signups. And that was, thankfully, that stopped mostly in the mid-2000s.
Oh, it didn't stop with me. As a lead pastor, I did it. Actually, I didn't shave. I let the students wax my legs, which was incredibly painful.
Let's leave the 2000s and the 2000s.
But we did it on stage where the entire church got to watch, and they all thought it was hilarious.
Before we did a video.
Yeah, that was
Donnie,
not pleasant. But anyway, Donnie, good to have you here, man. Donnie, I've known Donnie for many years. First met Donnie gosh, 20 years ago on the basketball court. Man, we used to play ball together occasionally, and
like Woody Harrelson and Wesley Snipes.
He's quite the baller, I'll tell you.
In fact, Donnie and his wife Amy left student ministry the year that I entered it. So draw whatever conclusions you will. But
smart move, my friend. Smart move.
When I was in 6th grade, Donnie, wow. So, but man, thank you for coming. And Donnie is the lead pastor at Vertical Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas, correct?
Correct.
Yes. And Northwest Arkansas, if you're from that region, you tend to cut it off from the rest of the state. And I don't know this because we're embarrassed of the rest of the state if you're in Arkansas or what, but
the rest of the state's embarrassed of them. Huh?
That's a good point.
Well, Donnie, why don't you give listeners a little bit of context? You're lead pastor at Vertical Church now.
Yep.
Give us an overview of your journey, where you've come from, so people get to know you a little bit.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you guys being here. And, I did leave youth ministry because of you, Ian.
I figured. I knew.
I'm just kidding. I was actually just real briefly in college. Felt called to the ministry. Fought that for about probably 6-7 years.
Noble fight.
And then when it was back in May of 2000 when I actually surrendered to the ministry, and it was in August of that year that Cross Church, formerly known as First Baptist Springdale, actually hired me as the high school associate. So I did that for about 2.5 years. From there, God called us to Florida, where I served as a student pastor there for about 2 years. From there, God called us to Texas, where I served as a student pastor there for 3 years. It was during that time the lead pastor came to me and asked me to consider praying about being the executive pastor. So at that time, I felt like youth ministry was coming to an end for me, but I didn't know what that next step was. So when this opportunity came before me, I just spent some time praying and just knew that this is what God had for us. So I did that for about 6.5 years. The last couple of years of being in that position, I really felt the stir to become a church planner. I have a shepherd's heart, but church planning was not something that I was considering or even wanted to pursue. But after about 2 years of wrestling with that, God made it very clear to do that. And so I resigned from the church in Texas. God called us to Northwest Arkansas to plant Vertical Community Church. We did that and started that in November of 14, and actually officially launched in the March of 15.
Yeah, that's awesome. It made me laugh when you said you fought the call to ministry. I was thinking about myself because it was a big fight for about 3 years. I was like, if you ever said, do you want to be a pastor? I would have said, no, expletive no. And but it's funny how God, we were talking with our students even last week, and I think growing up in the churches that I did and growing up, where we were at, it was, you'd always be like, God, please don't call me to ministry to be a missionary. I don't want to go to Africa, or whatever. We just find something. And it was kind of a revelation to me that God gives you a heart to do what he calls you to do, no matter how much you fight eventually. So I just think it's interesting. We got guys out there listening to this, or you're struggling through that. God isn't going to lock you in something that's just the worst thing you could ever imagine for the rest of your life. I mean, it's tough. But it was, I can't imagine doing anything else. So
I'll never forget. I was 10 years old when a lady who visited our church came up to me and said, there's a 15-year-old pastor in California. You're never too young to preach and become a pastor. And nice. I was 10 years old, and I was like, I will never, ever do that. So, thanks.
Ever.
And thanks, and bye.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Crazy. 15-year-old pastor. I've acted like I was 15 a lot as a pastor.
That's good.
Donnie, we've been talking about for a while now, red flags, and we've kind of made this, it's going to be the longest series we've ever done because it's just so important at so many different levels. And from somebody who's been a church planner and an executive pastor, a lead pastor, all of the above, and you've been all through ministry at this point. So you've encompassed probably everything but children's ministry at that point. And so, when we look at red flags, we wonder what that looks like. Have you ever seen any ministry hires that turn out poorly? And that things, like what were some of the red flags that you may have missed or that could have prevented that?
Or that you ignored, or you saw be ignored.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's a red flag, but that's okay. We still want, that's not that big of a deal. And it turns out it was. Any horror stories you want to share?
Class, that probably won't be a problem.
Well, if you're in ministry for any period of time, you have a horror story to tell.
That's right.
100%.
That people seek counseling for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, when I met my wife in college, we actually dated for a solid year, and we spent that entire year getting to know the good and the bad and the ugly of each of us, right?
Right.
As a pastor or executive pastor who's interviewing someone, you wish you had that time frame to get to know someone. One of the things I see too often is that pastors or executive pastors, we hire someone way too fast, too quickly, just because we needed that position to be filled yesterday.
Keeps on going.
I've seen that time and time again. And so one of the things that I was taught, but also try to put into play, is hire slowly. Because when you're looking for a position to fill, most often it's someone who submits a resume to you that you have no clue who they are. Yeah. And so a phone conversation or a Zoom meeting, which is great, and I'm thankful for technology these days.
Sure.
But it's hard to get to know the character of that person behind the screen. And so bringing them in, having a weekend with them. Yes, all these things are very important to have these conversations and interview process. But I know the person who wants to be hired is ready to be hired that day. But as a pastor, executive pastor who's looking to fill a position, you've got to be very careful to let that process be delayed if it needs to be. It's just like the whole marriage thing. When you meet somebody, you don't meet somebody next day, get engaged, and get married. You take the time. It's very crucial. It's very important.
A first date is not always the best impression, right?
Unless you're on 90-day fiance.
My first date with my bride, I completely forgot to get her phone number, and she thought, well, I guess I'm not his type. So I spent the entire next week looking for her number. I actually had to call my ex-girlfriend to say, "Hey,
oh gosh,
I heard you guys know each other." Yeah, that's another side note.
That's good. That's good.
At that point, though, was that before major cell phones? I mean, did you have a cell phone at that point?
He just called you old.
That was when bag phones were coming.
Bag phones,
right.
Yes.
I know this because I was in sixth grade when you started ministry and you were doing that. I was like in middle school. So I remember I had a Nokia brick when I was 14. That was pretty high tech.
Yeah.
I was playing Snake like a mad fool.
Oh yeah.
So
one of the things I say when we're interviewing somebody is, or what I do, is that I vet this person to the point that it might seem creepy. I check their social media posts. I look back, a period of time. I look and ask, who are they being mentored by? There's all kinds of things that I do. I call their references. And when I call their references, I even ask for that reference to give me another reference to contact. So I feel like when I'm vetting somebody, I go to hypersensitive, hyper mode. And I think it's critical as a pastor who's trying to protect the flock that it's worth it.
I think that's a really helpful tip for those listening that are in the middle of hiring someone. I want you to pick up on what Donnie said. He said he will ask the references for another reference, right? Yeah. And we've encountered, I think we talked about this before, how many times people don't even call the references that are on the resume, which is a huge no-no.
Yeah.
But even the references on the resume, they're going to be raving reviews because you're going to put your best people on there, right?
And if they're not, it's a bad call.
Then, which actually happened to me once. I called a reference on somebody I was potentially going to hire, and the reference, they said, yeah, I'm not sure why they listed me as a reference, but I would not hire them.
If all the references have the same last name,
okay, that's interesting. But yeah, why do they all? In general, that whoever is on that resume or as a reference, they're gonna say good things about them because that's why you put them on there. Yeah, and so it kind of helps as an added level of security or an added measure of safety to ask them, hey, who's somebody else that has been closely involved with this person, has seen them at work, that you can give me their number and I can call them too. And that kind of helps thin that out a little bit and get you a little more well-balanced perspective on where that person's coming from. So great tip.
Yeah,
that's helpful.
I think there's
that's from experience.
Oh, well, no, and I think there's give and take too. Like we know that sometimes it's not always the best idea. I mean, I think you should always call the church that you left. And most of the time, churches that you leave won't say a whole lot of bad things. We know that can be difficult. I love what Donnie does, where he says, I'm gonna get personal references across the board. I mean, because this isn't like you're hiring a sales associate who you need to go and schmooze people and sell. This is somebody that's going to be a pastor and a shepherd at your church, and
people.
You need to know who they are personally. And so I love that. Donnie, I mean, you know, because you're saying so much about it, we're doing it. But man, I think the last couple churches I've been at, I don't think they called all my references, but I know the last church I was at, they didn't call any of them. But what happened is they ended up having somebody right when I came that got fired for unethically handling money. And it was just crazy because his former church was so far in the past that he didn't have anything on there. And so the pastor didn't call the former church. And after he got fired and caused all this stank, sent out all of the church's financial information to the entire church body, which was awesome, or sent it out to several other guys. Yeah, it was the pastor's fault because he got a call from the guy at the other church said, hey, can I meet with you? And he went and met with him and he said, you just need to know he did the exact same thing to us. Why would you not have called us? It's like, okay. So I don't know. But that's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I feel like I get a better understanding of the person on the second layer of references.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they'll say, hey, I know this person. They're legit. Well, I don't know that person.
Right.
And so as a shepherd who protects the flock, you got to go the extra. Even I'll be honest, man, I did this in youth ministry, but I even do it even hiring people. As I do my research on them, I will ask the candidate questions sometimes that I already know the answer to.
Yeah.
I'm just going to see if I'm going to get a truthful response.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might be about the church. Sometimes it's just something random, off topic. They kind of let their guard down. I'm just trying to get a gauge. Is this person a person that's a truthful person?
Solid.
Which kind of leads me to my next thought is that don't hire or promote talent over integrity.
That's huge.
That's something that I tell our staff. I tell our church very often, especially when it comes to like musicians. You might be the best guitar player out in the city. Well, that's great, but we should never promote talent over integrity. And that should be any position, a volunteer position. It should be a key leadership position or a pastoral role, any position.
Yeah.
It's character, number one, I feel like, and you got integrity, number two. It's very important, because sometimes I've heard pastors say, well, this person is extremely educated, extremely experienced, highly creative, very organized. Like they say all these little key things that sounds great. But if you promote that person with that quality or all these qualities over integrity, man, I have personally witnessed time and time again that backfire and do more harm to a ministry or a church that's grieving. We already have enough battles with the enemy trying to bring division within the church, and so that's another layer of protection for me. And then here's something really personal. Another red flag that led to a poor hire, and this is a personal one that happened to us, is we were interviewing somebody to be a student pastor. My wife and I, and some churches are more event driven. We're very relationship driven. That means more the one-on-one relationship. That's how we did youth ministry. That's how I want our ministries to be ran, was more relationship driven. We were interviewing this guy to do youth ministry. We went through a couple of things with him. We brought in teenagers to this event, and I watched and observed body language in the interview process, but even kind of nonchalantly when they're not being interviewed, I feel like they're always being interviewed. And so I'm always looking for body language, how they respond. And one of the things we noticed that when teenagers were around, he never went over to connect with them. He never tried to engage. And that's something that it propped up in my head, but didn't think too much about it. We went ahead and hired the person, and just a few months into it, we quickly realized that's his MO. I mean, there was just this huge disconnect from the students into leadership. Eventually, that led to us having to part ways for various reasons. So that's something that when I'm saying I'm hypersensitive, I watch body language, I listen to responses, check references, and just being careful of the disconnect.
Yeah, that's good.
We even see one important, it's interesting because I've been in that position too, as a student pastor being hired. And honestly, I've always enjoyed, I don't think I've ever viewed student ministry as a stepping stone. I enjoyed whatever ministry God had me in, and I love doing it. But I remember at one point, it was an interesting change of events, because I wasn't being hired as the sole student pastor. I was being hired as multiple jobs. And then there was a current guy that was doing another area, working in some areas. He ended up leaving as soon as I was coming because of some bad culture and all that. So I took over all of it. But we went to a retreat where I met the whole staff, and it was just crazy because that was the thing they pointed out. And I didn't even think about it. I just enjoyed high school kids. And so I was talking with all the staff kids, and we were laughing and talking back and forth. And then I heard later on, they said, well, here's what's crazy. This guy never talks with any of our kids. And I did. And I kind of noticed it. He wouldn't talk with them. He wouldn't hang out with them. It was him and his wife and his little kid, his little boy, a couple of his boy and girl. And they just the whole time stay off to the side. And then I'd have all these kids around me. And it was just it was an interesting change. But I think another thing too is, especially when you should do this no matter what. But I think to your point, watching body language and all that, it's a lot easier than you might think too, to be careful of predators and people that you can see. How do they interact with younger students? How do they interact with students of the opposite gender? Sadly, that's something we've got to watch out for more.
What's their language like?
Yeah, what's their body language and language, and just crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great stuff.
So I feel like when you interview somebody, and the times that you sit down and have a conversation, and the times that you're not, that person or whoever it is, they're always being interviewed. And you got to train those who are with you doing this interview to pick up and be very hypersensitive, and pray for discernment, because you've got to protect the flock. And so, and people, when people say they want to do certain things, and I barely know them, because of the situation you just mentioned, Ian, I'm very cautious to let anybody just do anything. Like what's the motive behind this? So usually I always say, take some few months just to sit and observe, and
even in a non-predatorial way, I do remember some of the most difficult, because even the same with volunteers. When you get volunteers, you can put them in a great position, and if they're not ready to be there, it can just cause you so much havoc. But I remember I had a couple volunteers, and I think I was new, and the pastor said, hey, they've never done a whole lot until now, but they said now that you've come, they're ready to jump in. And so I met with them, and it seemed okay, and I should have paid more attention. Now that I look back, there's a lot of stuff. They told me all these stories and things that were like, this would be bad. But they ended up being the most difficult roadblock I had at that church for the 2 years I was there, because eventually it became, we didn't want to do anything until somebody would come that would put all the structure in. And now we can be seen as people that know everything about student ministry. And it just became really difficult. And so not even from even a sexual predator standpoint, which is important, but even from like what is your motive?
Yeah.
And where do you find your identity? And I think that's huge.
There's all kinds of sinful pitfalls that are lurking around the corner.
All of which are incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
Whether it's if you put a lot of stock in your volunteers, whether it's a staff member or volunteer, man, nobody wants to clean up the mess. It's like you said, wait. That's been the biggest thing we've heard is wait. We've heard to a lesser extent, but the second one is things like check references, but waiting is huge.
Yeah. Don't be too quick to jump into it.
Yeah.
Donnie, when have you seen, let's look at the other side of the coin now, and let's put a positive spin on things here. When have you seen a ministry hire go well? And what are some of the takeaways that, we can implement in various positions when we want to hire well?
Well, one of the things I was taught early on in ministry was 5 Ps. And I use this in so many different hiring processes, getting volunteers. I mean, in so much. It's proper people placement prevents problems.
Oh.
So when, yeah,
say that 5 times fast.
Proper people placement prevents problems. And so you go back to the side we're talking about, making sure that you fully vet that person, taking the time in the interview process. To me, also having so many people, not many people, but having others with you in leadership. Different churches are ran with different leadership structures. Some are deacon led, some are elder led, some are pastor led. I think it's unwise and unhealthy for one person to be doing all the interview processes. I feel like even as executive pastor, there was always a few people with me. Now I would begin the process, of the whole thing. I would weed through all the resumes and get to the point where, okay, let's go after these. But at that point, I would bring in elders with me, and sometimes other key staff members to help with the process, because I want to be able to see it from every angle with the discernment. If anybody, and it's one of those things, if anybody in the room has a red flag, then let's talk about it. And if it's something that a few people have, man, we're pulling the plug. And so I think having a lot of people in the process, having clear expectations, before the person's even hired, of saying, here is very clear expectations, who you report to. I mean, like when you go, I worked for JB Hunt for 2 years prior to going to the ministry. The first couple of days in the job, and you're given an employee handbook, you're given all this information, clear instructions about how this organization is ran. And I think sometimes in ministry, it's a Christian, it's a believer, it's a family, we kind of begin to not be so intense with that, with the protection of the references or anything like that. That we're like, this person's a believer, they're good. And just because they say they are,
and every family has different culture, right? They have different habits, they have different customs, they do things differently. And coming into, if I jump into and become part of this family and I live in their house, that's going to look very different than if I lived in the house across the street, right? Or across town. Right? It's going to be very different. And so there needs to be some kind of clear expectations set out ahead of time of, this is the kind of family we are. These are the things we value. These are the things that we shun away from. This is where there's grace. This is where we draw a hard line. All of those kinds of things. That is very helpful info to have up front. I mean, that sets up whoever you're hiring to not have that, sets them up for failure or sets them up for problems at a minimum, right? So you got to have that kind of stuff available.
What either predator or person that needs a job or whatever, whoever walks in going, no, I'm not really good. I mean, like when people say, well, they're a believer, who wouldn't say that? No wolf ever goes, hey, I'm a wolf, I want to go. So I laugh with that, because why would you don't do that in any other part of your life?
Again, not drop it. Not even on the predator side of things.
Any side. Idiots
think they're really good at their job.
That's true.
I mean,
that's true.
But
that's true. That's why
they're not. Like it's the American Idol syndrome, right? We apply that to ministry too. They think they're Celine Dion and they're
William Hung. She bang.
Oh gosh.
Well, here's the deal. I personally know people who are so gullible that, someone who can manipulate so easily can take one person and tell them that they're the best in the world, and let's hire this person. That's why I feel like it's so important to have people around you that are seeking the Lord prayerfully, praying for this position, asking God for clear direction, and asking for His protection over any red flags, to come to the surface before we hire this person. And so, and also I'm not a micromanager.
Right.
I always tell them up front.
Good for you, by the way.
Like if I have to micromanage you on staff, that pretty much means I don't need you any longer. And so we've had to do that occasionally with staff members, and it gets to the point where it's like, if I'm having to deep dive into your job with you, then it's, we'll retrain you, but we might have to retire you at some point. And so I always tell people up front, I'm not a micromanager, and so when you come on, I want you to flourish in your calling. And so I've seen this healthy wise once we pull the trigger and say, you're the person to say, listen, this is the ministry that you're over. That doesn't mean it's the only ministry you're involved in, but to flourish, let that person flourish at the same time, walking beside them in a healthy way to support them, and be their encouragement at the same time, not tell them everything they should do and how they should run their ministry. And I feel like doing that, once you get through the proper people, place, and prevents problems, and you go through all this other stuff and you pull the trigger, I personally witnessed when you let that staff member do that, they have some times they make some idiotic decisions.
Sure.
But they also, you can teach them through that and mentor them, and end up being some incredible staff members.
Well, go ahead.
I want to go back to and ask a follow-up question on one of the points that you made, Donnie, about involving other people in that process. What does it look like for you when you have you and your elders or whoever is on your group here that is making this decision on a prospective hire? What's the criteria for moving forward? Is it unanimous votes? Is it, if 3 out of 5 of you think this is a good hire, you move forward? Where do you say, okay, we're on board and we move forward, or no, we've got some reservations, we hold back? How much of your group, what percentage of your group has to be on board with the hire to move forward?
Well, so in the current position I'm in as a church planner, we do have myself and 3 others who serve as elders. So how we structure this, majority of pretty much all our decisions has to be unanimous. Now, sometimes one of them might say, hey, I don't really have a yes or no in this. And so I don't take that as a no if everybody else says yes. But when it comes to staff members and who we're going to hire, we all have to be in full agreement. If one, for me, when it comes to that, if one of my guys who I fully trust to carry the weight of the church alongside with me, who says, I have a concern here and a red flag, and I do the exact same thing when it comes to elders that we are considering. If we have one red flag or one concern, we're out.
That's good. That is good to hear. I remember we were at a church that was more elder led, and when they would bring it, they kind of pushed through. It seemed like there was more, even though they talked about all of it. It was just, that's good to hear that, because we'd have staff members that would have they'd have issues with one of the elders that they'd bring up, and they would, the pastor would say, well, have whatever opinions you want, and you can think all this. I want you to be able to be honest and open. And then the person was honest and open, voted against the person. And then later on, the pastor grabbed me and went, can you believe that she would do that? And I went, well, yeah, because you told her to. And then you just disregarded what she said. And I think that is huge. It's like, what, I don't know. And there were fair things being brought up. And maybe one question too, I guess I wanted to parse out with you a little bit more was, you said I'm not a micromanager. I've served for a lot of micromanagers, but they were not micromanagers either by their own. Like they would say, well, I don't micromanage. We're all about leadership development, all that. Where do we see that line? Because I know you're not, but I'm saying, like, in general, I don't think anybody identifies as a micromanager, but where do we kind of draw that line between I'm hiring somebody, because that's the worst. I've been hired at churches where they say flourish, there's no ceiling. And the better I do, and the more that we grow and the more influence we get, and the better off it goes, the more they restrict you, because they don't like that you're growing and doing really well. They want to be involved in every single thing. What are the warning signs too, if you're on the other side of the hire, that you're interviewing with a micromanager? That makes sense.
Well, if I heard the question right,
Was a long
basically what you just said was, I feel like that's probably, if you're growing a ministry and you're beginning to flourish and they start taking more ownership of that, it sounds like an insecurity on that person's part.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and how do we identify that? What are some red flags you would identify with, not on your side of the hire, but if you are interviewing with a head pastor or a lead pastor, are there some warning signs or some red flags you could give for somebody interviewing that they might be being told that they can flourish and do everything they want to do, but they're not really in a good position to do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I would ask specific questions concerning different ministries, and I would listen to how deeply involved are they getting into those ministries. I totally get it. There's seasons of time where, as lead pastors, executive pastors, that we come down and we kind of walk beside that certain staff member for a period of time, for a certain season, for some kind of event. But if that's something that you hear that person does often, in different people, to me, that's a red flag. That's a micromanager. And there was a staff member one time for one of our churches that we were at, that there was some, this person wanted everything to come to this certain person to filter through. I started realizing, okay, why does everything have to filter through you, who has nothing to do with that ministry? Well, it was a power play and everything, and I could see his position, why some of it would happen. But then we got to get to the point where I had to, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, meet with this guy. Well, okay, here's the jobs for today. Give me an update, every day, like a couple times a day. And if someone is doing that, then to me, that's a micromanager. And, and man, I don't flourish well in that. I don't want to be managed that way, though. Either.
Yeah, I think, some of the questions you can ask when you're interviewing and you're trying to find out if your new potential employer is a micromanager.
Right.
You're asking that employer questions like, how much of my decision-making process do you need to be a part of? And probably whatever percent they give you, double it.
That's true.
Right. If I only want to be a part of 20% of it, they're going to want to be a part of 40 to 60% of it. But so you're asking those kinds of questions of your prospective manager. You're asking, what percentage of the decision-making process do you want to be a part of? How frequently do I need to check in with you when I have a decision to be made?
Yeah.
Who else should I go to if I'm unsure about a particular direction for this ministry? Or just in the day-to-day stuff, is there someone else besides you I should go to? Right. If there never is, then that's an indication that they want it all to come to them. But I think the other really important side of it, in the same way that as the employer, you want a group of people making that decision-making process, as the prospective employee, you want to be interviewing different people on that team. Yeah. And you want to be asking about your boss. Hey, one of the sets of questions I have is around how my potential boss is a leader. Do they micromanage? How often do they have to know all this stuff? You're asking those kinds of questions of those that are around that person. That's going to give you a good indication of what kind of environment you might be. Might be stepping into.
It just made me think, because everybody, we always hear micromanager, and I've served for several, and they never are. Yeah, and they make a point to tell you they're not, like in the interview process. And I just thought, man, I wish I had gone back and asked some of those questions.
Yeah, very few of them are going to tell you, I micromanage you, and I want you to come here and do exactly what I say. That doesn't really happen. Yeah. But that does lead us to our last question of the interview, Donnie. If you are put yourself in the shoes of someone who is interviewing for a lead pastor role, or is interviewing for an executive pastor role, what are some of the red flags that they need to be looking for in the prospective church that they're going to? That maybe they see something and they need to ask deeper questions about it, or it's an automatic no, stay away from this kind of thing. Any suggestions or tips you would have for listeners who are potentially interviewing with someone?
Because it is a uniquely different process.
Yeah.
For a lead pastor.
I do, because I wish I would have asked these questions going into the second church I ever served at. Okay. I went in very young, very naive, thinking
with a bag phone.
It's a church. It's a good church. One of the questions I would ask is, what's the history of this church? Because once I got on staff there and started to hear those who've been in the church for a while describe the history of the church, it was grieving. The former pastor embezzled a bunch of money. He got caught. He quit. Started a church in the same town, just a few miles down from the church, and that just completely divided the church in half.
Wow.
What's the culture of this church currently? How has the culture changed over the past decade? I think some of the questions you just said a while ago, Michael, concerning the micromanager questions, those are legit questions. What's the reputation does this church have in the community? If you're there going around town and just playing dumb and saying, "Hey, I'm considering going to this certain church on Sunday. What do you know about it?" And just kind of listen to the community, what they say about it. Because when I got there and into the community, our church had a bad reputation because of what happened about a decade before I got there. How was this church? Well, what's the desire? How this church is to be led? How has it been led currently before you show up? How has it been led, a decade ago? Those kind of questions I feel like are very, very important, along with the questions you just asked a while ago concerning the micromanager. If you're going to show up as executive pastor, do you have the freedom to implement elders? Is this church familiar with that? The church I went to, I didn't realize there was a multi-millionaire in the church who, when someone had a debt, he would pay off your debt. So when it came time to the pastor I served under wanted to make a change, and this guy didn't want it to go that way, he would remind you that I paid off your debt.
He owned all the strings, didn't he?
He owned all the strings. So the 2 years that we were there, it was hard to make any culture change the way we wanted to go. I was so aligned with the pastor that was there that we ended up both just feeling called away because we couldn't make any progress there. But I didn't ask any of these questions going into it. And if you're gonna go lead the body, the flock, it's important to know who is the flock.
Yeah, absolutely.
Money is a dangerous game too when you get into all of that. I mean, I remember different people in different churches that would, it was just really funny. Every year it became known that you would go to this guy and ask for camp scholarships. I was a student pastor, and I'd go and say, "Hey, can we get these guys?" He had a ton of money, but he always wanted you to ask him, so he would never offer it. He wanted people to come and sit. And the first year I ever did that, they told me that, and I just went, "This is odd and uncomfortable." And I went, "Can we have?"
I feel like Oliver Twist.
Hey, sir, may I have some more? We said, "Hey, last year you gave 8,000. Could you give 12,000 this year? We think we're going to take about 400 or 500 kids to camp." And he went, "And we need help for that." And he goes, "Well," and he would always come back, and it wasn't like, sure, you go, "Well, I did give 8 last year. 12 is a pretty big jump. I guess I could maybe give 10. But it was all like this big show and game. And he was like, "So I'll write you a check." And then he'd walk away, and I felt dirty. I don't even know. It was weird. So, God.
Well, I want to make sure I say this to you, okay? Some of the filters that I feel like, that are more universal versus more specific. Of course, universal. Does the person have a calling? Sometimes people look at it as just a job, and it's not a job; it's a ministry, and they're so different. A job, a person will get burned out very, very, very quickly. Yeah. And so is it a calling? I go back to the character of the person and all that. I feel like more specific is the chemistry aspect. If you are interviewing somebody and you're not particularly connecting with this person in the interview process, you have to realize you're going to be with this person, every week, every day throughout the week. And it's like, and so one of the things I heard Johnny Hunt say one time is hire people you like to be around. And so I was like, that's a great point, man. Chemistry is very important. And of course, culture. As a shepherd, you've got to know the culture of your flock. And there's been people even that who are very highly educated, highly experienced, have great credentials that could fill a position here at our church currently, or the church I came from. But I just knew the culture of our church and the culture of that person, and that would be a bad connection. I feel like that would be a position that our people would not follow, and this person would just not be in a win-win situation. And as a shepherd, these are people's lives. And so you protect the flock, but you also want to put your staff member in a win-win position.
That's good.
One of the hardest things I've ever wrestled with when churches didn't go well or they didn't hold up their end of the bargain is I had to deal with a lot of bitterness and still struggle with some of it of saying, man, because a lot of times though, churches will oversell who they are just to, like we said, to rush to get somebody in there and I just remember going, man, I had to move my wife, my whole life, my family. And at the end of the day, I didn't get to do anything. It was just miserable for 2 years because you just tried to get me in. And I think that's a huge point, is that you are not only your church body, but the lives, that's a big deal. And I don't think, never got apologies from those pastors, but I watched them do it with a lot of people and just didn't care. And so you're stewarding. That's a huge thing you're stewarding. That's somebody's entire life that they're moving to come and be a part of what you're doing.
Well, so. one time in all the churches I interviewed, I had a staff member pull me aside and say, hey man, I wrote down several negative things about this church that the staff or the pastor will never tell you about. And I'm like, at one hand, I was like, I really appreciate this. On the other hand, I'm like, what's the motive here?
Yeah, that's
nice.
And
does your boss know you're giving me this list?
Oh gosh.
I went ahead. I felt called to go to that church, and I opened up my desk drawer one time of that former staff. That person no longer was there. I opened up the drawer in pencil in the drawer. It says, "Run as fast as you can." God! So I was like, "Where have I come?"
Yes.
Oh gosh, that's hilarious.
So good. Well, Donnie, man, this has been really, really good.
Yeah, thank you.
So proper people placement prevents problems.
Yes.
And
I'm gonna post that.
And you vet that process through calling, character.
Yep.
Competency,
trying to find all the C's,
and culture,
chemistry.
Like, if this isn't three pastors sitting around talking with all the alliterations, then I don't know what is.
It's the new kind of PC.
Good stuff. Man, we could have done without that.
Okay, well, whatever.
All right, guys. Thank you so much, Donnie. Thanks again. Appreciate you joining us. And we'll see y'all next week.
May your ministry stay healthy.
And your coffee stay hot.
Boom!
That's backwards.
I know, but we switched it. I just want to see you do it. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Mad Pastors podcast today. We hope that you found it not only encouraging, but beneficial that you have people in your corner doing ministry. Here's what we'd love for you to do. If you'd subscribe, review, and share our podcast, that would mean the world to us, and it'd help as many pastors to hear and be encouraged just like you were. G6 is also supported by partners and allies like you who are willing to financially give and be a part of this ministry with us. So if you feel like you'd like to be a part of this with us, just go to g6allies.com/partner, and we'd love for you to become our ally in our mission to serve pastors and their families. If you have questions, comments, or just want to talk more with us about your particular ministry needs, just email us at hello@g6allies.com. We can't wait to see you next time for our next episode.